Hey everybody, this video is called The Reign of Uzziah, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Chronicles, where we're going to be looking at the reign of King Uzziah next. So 2 Chronicles chapter 26 verse 1 through 5 starts out. Now all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father, Amaziah. He built Elath and restored it to Judah. After the king rested with his fathers, Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jecoliah of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding of visions of God, and as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. So we see here Uzziah is also known as Azariah, who reigned between 791 to 739 BC. And we see a parallel passage here, like many other of the kings in this book, that goes back to 2 Kings 14 verse 21-22 and 2 Kings 15 verse 1 through 7. And during the king's rulership, Uzziah, the prophets Hosea, Amos, and Jonah and Isaiah ministered during his reign. And the chronicler, he's showing us Uzziah's rise to power here. He shows us Uzziah's obedience and blessing, his disobedience and curse and summary and death. And we see that King Uzziah was 16 years old when he was co-regent with his father. And Aloth in verse 2 was a port in Aqaba, which was repossessed by Edom during Jehoram's reign back in chapter 21 verse 8 through 10. And the chronicler, he compares Uzziah with his father, and once again omits the notice in Kings about the failure that the king had in removing the high places. In verse 5, Zechariah, he's an unknown prophet. We should not think of the Zechariah in verse 5 as the prophet from the book of Zechariah. So he's an unknown prophet during the reign of Uzziah. He's not a priestly spokesman that we saw as well back in chapter 24 verse 20, or the prophet who wrote the prophetic book to Judah in 520, the book of Zechariah, like I mentioned. In Sought and Prosper, it summarizes a main theme that we find throughout the book of 2 Chronicles. And verse 6 through 15, it says, Now he went out and made war against the Philistines and broke down the wall of Gath, the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod. And he built cities around Ashdod and among the Philistines. God helped him against the Philistines, against the Arabians who lived in Gur-baal, against the Mennonites. Also the Ammonites brought tribute to Uzziah. His fame spread as far as the entrance of Egypt, for he became exceedingly strong. And Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and the corner buttress of the wall. Then he fortified them. And he built towers in the desert. He dug many wells, for he had much livestock, both in the lowlands and in the plains. He also had farmers and vine dressers in the mountains and in Carmel, for he loved the soil. Moreover, Uzziah had an army of fighting men who went out to war by companies, according to the number of their roll, as prepared by Jael the scribe, and Maaseiah the officer, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. The total number of chief officers, the mighty men of valor, were 2,600, and under their authority was an army of 375 that made war with mighty power to help the king against the enemy. Then Uzziah prepared for them, for the entire army, shields, spears, helmets, body armor, bows, and slings to cast stones. And he made devices in Jerusalem, invented by skillful men, to be on the towers and the corners, to shoot arrows and large stones. So his fame spread far and wide, for he marvelously helped till he became strong. So when we see the locations of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod, they were the key Philistine cities southwest of Jerusalem. In verse 7, Arabians, Ger-Baal, most likely was the nomadic group who lived in the area whose location is unknown. And the Menusites were a nomadic people living in Edom, as we saw back in chapter 20, verse 1. And the Ammonites, they were the offspring of Lot, who lived east of the Jordan. And so here we saw a description of Judah's military success to the west, east, and south. And the corner gate was the northwest section of Jerusalem. And the Wally Gate is not speaking about Walmart. I know sometimes, depending what part of the country in the United States you live in, you might refer to Walmart as Wally World. But Wally Gate was located southwest of the section of Jerusalem. And Corner Buttress was in the east section of Jerusalem. So Uzziah, he built a reversal of the destruction in Amaziah's defeat in the last chapter, verse 23. And in verse 10, Carmel isn't speaking about the mountain range, as it wasn't in the territory under Uzziah. And it should not be taken as a proper name, but rather translated for Carmel as a fertile field. And there's also fits rest of the general references in the verse. And we see the summary of Uzziah's prosperity in the realm of conquering the Philistines, the domestic affairs and military might. And with over 300,000 in the army and the development of new weapons, he posed a threat to would-be assailants and therefore secured the nation in peace. And the chief reason for Uzziah's success was God's help, which helped is a special word in 2 Chronicles, which points to a bigger meaning in the New Testament, which we're going to cover in the wrap-up. In verse 16 says, "But he was strong in his heart. He was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense." So when you go back to the law in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 10 through 18, Moses warned Israel to be careful to not let their success make them proud and self-reliant. And Uzziah violated what he had become a general principle in God's dealing with Israel, that no king should be a priest, and that the office of prophet, priest, and king should not be combined in one man until the Messiah, Jesus, comes to fulfill all three of these offices. And we see that Uzziah, he started out great, but he was unfaithful, which hadn't been since Rehoboam's time back in chapter 12, verse 2. And now it will become a regular theme as the end of this book goes on. In verse 17 through 21, "So Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men, and they withstood King Uzziah, and said to him, It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. You shall have no honor from the Lord God." Then Uzziah became furious, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord, besides the incense altar. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and there on his forehead he was leprous, so they thrust him out of that place. Indeed, he also hurried to get out, because the Lord had struck him. King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He dwelt in an isolated house because he was a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord. Then Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. And so Uzziah, he attempted to overstep the role of the priest, which was forbidden back in the law in Numbers chapter 3, verse 10, and Numbers 18:7. In Proverbs 16:18, and that's a favorite verse of mine, tells us that pride precipitates a fall. And we see that it did so in this case. And even the king could not live above God's law. Those who are put in authority in government positions cannot be above God's law. And God judged the king's refusal to heed the law, but we see that God, at the same time, God was merciful in that he'd not kill Uzziah instantly. And with leprosy, he had to submit to the priests in a whole new way according to the laws of leprosy that we found back in Leviticus 13 and 14. And he had to endure isolation for the rest of his life from the temple as well. In the chronicler, he highlights for the third time the roles of the priests as instructors of royalty. And burning incense is restricted to the priests in the Mosaic law. In Uzziah, he's quarantined and kept out of the temple in compliance of the law of Moses back in Leviticus 13:46 and Numbers 5 verses 1 through 4. And to wrap up the verses here in the chapter, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah from first to last, the prophet Isaiah the son of Amos wrote. So Uzziah rested with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of burial, which belonged to the kings, for they said, he is a leper. Then Jotham his son reigned in his place." So verses 22 and 23 here, Uzziah was buried away from the royal family in relative dishonor because the curse that he had come upon him of leprosy. And to make note here, the canonical book of Isaiah, but rather it was a reference to some other volume that the prophet wrote. And it was in that very year that Isaiah had the vision of God's glory in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1. And so to wrap up today's video, we see that the chronicler show the overview of Uzziah's reign. And we observe the strength and the security, the fame of Uzziah's reign. And we see that Uzziah, he had a proud heart, and the confrontation and fitness punishment came upon him. And Uzziah, he came into the temple as a arrogant king, and he left as a humbled leper. And let that be a warning for us that if we're going to be haughty or prideful, that we are going to be humbled. You know, in the New Testament, I don't remember the passage exactly. I believe it's in 1 Peter. You know, it says, "Humble yourselves or be humbled." And it left his freedom more restricted than ever before. And that is what pride and sin is going to do to you. You might think that you have freedom to partake in those matters, but it's going to restrict your freedom more, because if you belong to God, you are going to be under the chastisement of God. And sin steals your freedom. If you get nothing out of it, remember that sin steals your freedom. And we see the ending involving King Uzziah's death and his burial. And the death of the king contributed to the call of the prophet. And Uzziah has a tragic end after reigning a very long time of 52 years, as he started at the age of 16. And he led Israel to many military victories, and he was an energetic builder with a vision. And Isaiah, though, saw the enthroned Lord God, who was greater than any other earthly king. And we'll see you next, as we're going to be looking at Jotham's godly reign tomorrow. So hope that you come back for tomorrow. No topical Saturday this week, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.